All right, everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the concept of positive and negative leverage in commercial real estate. Let's get started. So on the agenda, we're first going to define what that phrase or what this topic really even means, right? Like, what does it mean to have positive and or negative leverage? How do you calculate positive or negative leverage? And finally, how do you apply it, which is ultimately, I think, the most critical piece of this whole video. So to dive in, what does it mean to have positive leverage? And I think it's in its most simple way. Positive leverage means when you borrow more, your returns improve. So if we think about cash on cash, if we think about IRR, if we think about the levered metrics of return, so those metrics that are affected by how much we borrow or how we borrow, if those metrics improve when we borrow more, then we have positive leverage. And so if that's positive, then I think obviously the opposite is true. If our metrics decline, if our performance gets worse as a result of borrowing more, then we have negative leverage. So in the same way, from a very generic sense, in the same way that we can think about leverage as a way to amplify performance. So if we borrow more and performance improves, then we have positive leverage. But if we borrow more and performance falls or declines or worsens, then we have negative leverage. So the leverage is really just going to amplify how good or how bad the deal performs. That inflection point between positive and negative, though, is what we're going to be talking about now. So first, how do you calculate whether you have positive or negative leverage? And I think the easiest way to do it is to compare your cap rate to your mortgage constant. Now, my guess is that some of you are going to listen to this and you're going to say, I think I understand what cap rate is. Don't necessarily feel comfortable or don't understand what mortgage constant is. So if you don't mind, let's take a quick detour. We'll spend a couple minutes to really define what mortgage constant is, why it's so valuable, especially in the context of trying to figure out positive and negative leverage. So let's take a quick sidebar. So first, what is the mortgage constant? The way that I tend to define it is, think of it as the true cost of borrowing. It's typically represented as a percentage, and it is an annualized cost or interest rate, if you want to think of it like that, that we can use to help benchmark against. So in this case, we're going to benchmark it against cap rate and to determine whether we have positive or negative leverage. That's why we're here today. So there's two main ways to calculate mortgage constant. The first is you could take annual debt service and divide it by the loan that you borrowed. So as a quick example, if I borrowed $1 million and I have an annual debt service of $100,000, I'll take $100,000 divided by $1 million and I'll get a mortgage constant of 10%. Now another way to do this is to use the payment function, and you can calculate the payment given an interest rate and an amortization term, but really of only borrowing $1, because the mortgage constant is going to stay the same if you borrow $1 or $1 billion or anything in between, given the same interest rate and term. So just to kind of show you what this could look like, if it's an amortizing loan and you wanted to use the payment function, then you'll go about this the same way you always do. It's what's the rate divided by 12, what's the term times 12, only you'll put $1 as the PV instead of the actual loan amount. And then you'll annualize it by multiplying by 12. Now if that's an amortizing loan, if it's an interest-only loan, I think it's a lot more straightforward. It's just whatever the interest rate is. So these are the two ways in which you can think about how do you calculate a mortgage constant. You can use annual debt service and divide it by the loan amount. And if you don't know the loan amount, then you can either take the payment function of $1 or the annual interest rate on an interest-only loan. So I think, again, a quick example is going to be important here. So if we have an interest rate of 4.5 and an amortization term of 30 years, we can calculate the monthly payment. So again, the PMT on $1, and then we can annualize it. and we can convert it to a percentage. And it'll give us that 6.08. And so notice that the 6.08 is slightly higher than the actual interest rate on the loan. Now, that shouldn't come as much of a surprise, because keep in mind that the interest rate of 4.5 is going to define the interest portion of every payment. But if the loan is amortizing, every payment is going to be comprised of both interest and principal reduction. So your payment is more than 4.5% because you're paying the loan down as well. And so that extra difference, that premium, that increase in rate is really attributable to the amortized portion of principal repayment during the life of the loan. And so in this case, given what our amortization term looks like, our annualized payment, or in this case, our mortgage constant, is slightly higher than our interest rate. The shorter the amortization term, the much higher increase we'll tend to see in the mortgage constant. So let's come back and kind of relate why we even went down that path. So if the cap rate is greater than the mortgage constant, then we have positive leverage, and the opposite is also true. If cap rate is less than, then we have negative leverage. And if the two are equal, which is tough to come by, but if the two are equal, then we have neutral leverage. And I think at the end of the day, all this really means is that if I have positive leverage, then the more I borrow, the more I'm going to amplify or improve my levered return metrics like IRR and cash on cash. And if it's negative, the more I borrow, the worse those metrics will be. So let's provide like a quick proof as an example, just to make sure that we understand kind of why it's doing what it is and to kind of prove out the concept. So let's say I offer an investment opportunity for you to buy this gem of a property. Waterfront, I know everyone likes that these days. And so if you can purchase this today, these are the terms. So you can purchase it for 3 1/8, so $3.125 million. And we estimate that once we make some minor improvements, maybe just some paint, we can collect a net operating income of $200,000. Now, maybe you don't have the $3.125 million, so you have to get a loan. And if you do, you'll get a loan on these terms. So 50% loan to value, 4.5 interest rate, 30-year amortization. So given this opportunity, this purchase price, this NOI, and these loan terms, let's calculate a couple return metrics. So the first is going to be what's the going-in cap rate. Second is going to be what's the mortgage constant given that loan term. And last is going to be cash on cash, so that we can recognize the impact that borrowing has on this investment. And so just to kind of gut check my math, down here at the bottom, I provided what the numbers are that I use to calculate each one of the metrics up in the top right. So as a quick example, going in cap rate of 6.4 is $200,000 divided by the purchase price. Now, what I want us to focus on are these two highlights. So what happens if we borrow more or less? What happens to cash on cash? So in this case, if you'll notice, going in cap rate is slightly greater than mortgage constant. 6.4 is slightly greater than 6.08. And so our cash on cash is a little better than our going in cap rate. So this is an example of how we have positive leverage. By borrowing more, our cash on cash is a little higher than cap rate. And if we borrow more than the original 50%, our cash on cash should increase. We have positive leverage because cap rate is greater than constant. So again, in the example you see now, LTV, loan to value, is 85% instead of 50. By borrowing more, our levered metrics improve. And we would have expected that to be true because our cap rate is greater than our constant. And so again, down at the bottom, if you want to check my math, the numbers are there. So now let's see what happens if we come back and we revert to the original LTV of 50%, but our interest rate increases. So the interest rate on the loan is now 5.75%. So again, taking a look at the top right, cap rate didn't change, but constant increased to 7.0. Now we're looking at a circumstance where cap rate is less than constant. Because of this, we have negative leverage. Our cash on cash is now less than our cap rate. And so if we borrow more, our cash on cash is going to get worse. So in this case, the more we borrow, the worse our returns are getting. So for me, I think this is a critical example of what happens as we borrow and the impact that borrowing has. So positive leverage means the more we borrow, the better our levered returns look. And if it's negative leverage, the opposite is true. The worse they look. So again, just to kind of recap this, our returns improve when we borrow more. That's an example of positive leverage. And our returns worsen when we borrow more. That's an example of negative leverage. So high level, what we went through today was first to define, like, what does positive or negative leverage even mean, right? The concept that if we borrow money, what impact does it have on performance? Does it improve or worsen? How do you calculate negative or positive leverage? So two main ways: payment function or annual debt service over loan amount. And then how do you apply it? So taking a look at that relationship between cap rate and mortgage constant so that we can figure out right out of the gate, if we borrow more, will it improve or will it hurt? I hope you found this video helpful. Talk to you guys soon. Thanks.